The Witness the World podcast represents the personal views of the host and guests at the time of recording. These views may change over time. The content here is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Any content here should not be construed as financial, medical, or any other type of professional advice. Please consult with a qualified practitioner should you require any professional advice. Good day, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of the Witness the World podcast. My name is Ben Choi, and today we'll be heading to Trinidad and Tobago. Our guest is a yoga teacher, author, and a motivational speaker. Today, we'll learn about his journey and how he helps and encourages others on their path to discovering spirituality, mindfulness, and becoming better human beings. Troy Hadeed, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, pleasure, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So, you've had quite an interesting journey from what I've read thus far. So, you've traveled around the world, you did some schooling abroad, you came back home, opened a business, and went on to try some different jobs and finally landing in the yoga industry. So,
Yeah.
just wondered if you could start us off giving us a little bit of a background about yourself growing up in Trinidad, going to university elsewhere, and some of your early adventures in life.
Yeah. So I was born in Trinidad, and my father comes from Middle Eastern Syrian ancestry lineage. So his parents actually came here. We came here, and that generation kind of started off the Middle Eastern infiltration into Trinidad. And then my mom's family is Irish. So people always ask, a majority of Trinidadians are Indian or African ancestry. So very often when someone hears my accent, they look at me and then hear my accent, and then it's like almost like a jolt, and they're like, "Huh, where's this guy from?" Um, so yeah, growing up in Trinidad was You know, Trinidad's a really beautiful, amazing place. And growing up here had a lot of privileges in being in and among nature and among a multicultural society. I mean, Trinidad has all kinds of um, all kinds of races and cultures, and people just come together. So you get all of those influences. I grew up 7 years the youngest of two brothers. I think my mom was hoping for a girl. Didn't work out as she planned. Um, and growing up, I grew up in very much a privileged society, and my family was well off, and we were, name Hadeed is known to come from, you know, pretty well off means. And not everyone in Trinidad is. So, it was interesting to note my privilege. And there were times when I would be ashamed of my privilege. And, growing up and as I got older, I realized that if I was ashamed of my privilege, it owned me. And it would prevent me from using my privilege to serve something greater. So luckily, my mindset moved beyond that, and I was able to own the privilege I had and see how I could use that to serve people around me. And I went to school. I'll just fast forward a little bit so we don't get stuck on all of it. But I ended up going to University of Tampa in Florida, and I studied business and Spanish, even though I really wanted to do writing and philosophy. My father encouraged me to do business, which I don't regret at all. because when I came back home after university, my last semester at university is noteworthy because I did a program called Semester at Sea, where I traveled the world on a ship and literally went around the world on a ship, 14 or 15 different countries. And I think in those 4 months, I learned and grew more than I did in 4 years at university. And when I came back home, I remember my dad asking me, well, what do you want to do? What are you going to do? Because I'd always told him I was not going to work in a family business. And I told him, well, I'm going to open a hemp store. And of course, he didn't really, wasn't really gelling with that too much. But that was my first business. I've always been self-employed. I've never worked for anyone else really as such. And at 21 years old, I opened a hemp store, which I ran for 7 years, and I want to stress, I stress to people, this was a hemp store, not a head shop. So it was a hemp store in which I was an advocate for cannabis sativa to be used for making clothes and cosmetics and environmental means to promote cannabis sativa. I was not a smoker of cannabis. I still am not a smoker of cannabis. There's a common misconception around that. But I ran that store for about 7 or 8 years. And then funny enough, even before I was a yoga practitioner, people would ask me, well, what are you going to do with your life? And I'll say, well, I'm going to be a yoga teacher. And they'll be like, well, do you do yoga? And I'll be like, no, but I know I'm going to teach yoga one day. I just knew it, right? After about 6 years of running a retail store, I realized that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I wasn't having any impact that I really wanted to have. So I did my first yoga teacher training. I came back home, started teaching yoga. And then even before I opened a yoga studio, I opened a waste oil recycling business. So we collected waste cooking oil from restaurants around Trinidad and Tobago. We cleaned the oil, processed the oil, and exported it for biofuel. So that was a very successful business, and everyone thought I was a complete lunatic when I started it because I closed my retail store and I put everything I had into this business. And Trinidad is not a culture where people value the environment or sustainability. It's a very fossil fuel driven business. And nobody thought it was a good idea. Everybody thought I was an absolute lunatic. It was a really successful business. And I remember when these guys flew in to look at my product and the waste cooking oil and the product I was producing. And my father was in complete disbelief. He was almost shocked to see all these guys in suit and ties flying to look at this waste cooking oil. And it was a really successful business for about, or still is, but after about 4 or 5 years, I sold it, which then gave me the ability to focus all my energy on building a yoga studio and yoga community, which is really what fired me up and still fires me up today, even though the studio itself is closed at the moment. And then I just finished writing a book, which is something I knew I would do one day. So that's me in a nutshell, Ben.
Excellent. Thanks for the background there, Troy. So,
Yeah,
I think you mentioned about like the providing more impact in what you're doing. Was that the main driver, but as a reason why you shifted from hemp store to biofuels, and then all of a sudden to yoga? I mean, they're very different things. And
yeah.
was that the primary reason why you want to provide more impact,
Um,
or?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Ben, is that so so from the beginning I knew that whatever I chose to do could not be driven by money. I wouldn't be happy if it was just about making money. I knew I think this came along with the concept of owning what I refer to as owning my privilege, right? If my privilege only serves me and no one else, um, then that's not a that's being owned by my privilege. And I realized that the opportunities I had in my life, whatever I did, I wanted to serve something greater than myself. So at first with the hemp store, it was more environmentally good. Um, and then I think when I switched to the recycling business, even though it was environmentally driven as well, I realized that having a retail store was not having the environmental impact I wanted it to have. And I felt that when I switched to a waste recycling business, that I could really, I mean, I converted my truck to run on waste cooking oil. So, and I got a lot of media coverage locally. So I figured that I could get a lot more attention and at least shift the perspective of people, and have a larger impact in that way. Because in Trinidad, I mean, I still consider Trinidad a third world country. And when I started that business, I could guarantee that 95% of waste cooking oil from restaurants and kitchens was being poured down the drain, right? So for me, it was huge to at least start there. But to answer your question, there was really a shift in me to shift away from an environmental focus to more of a emotional focus, a mental focus, a spiritual focus in which I felt I could have more impact on people. And, there was one day when I realized that a lot of people in Trinidad didn't care for the environment. And I was trying to push them to care for the environment. But here's the thing, if someone doesn't feel safe or secure, you can't ask them to care for the environment. I realized that there was a large population in Trinidad that did not feel cared for, did not feel safe, was living on the poverty line, had no sense of wellness or mindfulness or no sense of peace at all. So if there's a saying in Trinidad, I don't know if you guys have heard it. It says, or I'm not too sure who said this. Maybe it's bigger than Trinidad. But before you talk to someone about God, you have to feed them first. So the basic needs have to be met. And I realized that the concept is very much the same, that the basic needs in Trinidad were not being met. And that I was trying to speak to people about the environment who didn't recognize that they were part of a collective well being. So I think I realized at that point that for me to really have an impact, I wanted to shift to the individual. And I realized in a nutshell, our world is made up of 8 billion people. And each one of those individuals have a series of relationships. So if I could help the individual grow in an emotional, mental, spiritual way and impact how they show up in their relationships, then I can have a real impact on society and on people and on the world around me. That actually shifted my focus from trying to have an environmental impact to now realizing that I could have more of an impact if I targeted the individual and helped them cultivate a sense of wellness and peace within themselves to create this collective well being, to encourage them to serve something greater than themselves.
Thanks for sharing that, Troy. It makes sense. So it's just kind of curious. Everybody goes through a journey to get them to this stage on, viewing things differently. And this is probably something that you developed over time, and maybe there's some experiences that kind of, you had that epiphany moment, something kind of struck a nerve with you. And when I was reading some of the stuff you did, you mentioned that you were on multiple like occasions where you did like you were silent for like 10 days, so like some, I don't know, a
Yeah.
silence retreat. So was curious, like doing those kind of experiences, did that kind of spur something in you to get you to this direction, this new approach to life and helping others? Maybe that was a factor in that, perhaps.
That was a profound experience in itself. That came a few years after I was teaching yoga. But if I, Ben, it's funny, after writing this book I just finished, it's like I think I learned more about myself in writing that book because I look back on my upbringing and I try to look at, well, what influenced me? At 10 years old, I wrote a letter to that was published in all our newspapers, and a copy of that letter was sent to President Bush, Saddam Hussein, Mikhail Gorbachev, with the help of my mom, of course. But that letter of a 10-year-old, of course, I was 10, so it was poorly written. But it was pleading for the end of the Gulf War. It was pleading for the end of war. It was pleading for us to take note of environmental destruction. And I often ask myself, well, what drove me to write that at 10 years old? Like, what did I feel? And I grew up with a very large influence from reggae music and Rastafarian culture. And I think that instilled within me um, a drive to want to have an impact on the world. And I think that's where it all began, right? That had a huge impact on me as well. And with regards to silent retreat, I'll tell you why I decided, even after a few years of teaching yoga, that I had to partake in this silent retreat. It was something I had to experience, was because I began to realize the power of the mind. And I began to realize that the mind was actually one of the most powerful things we have access to. In my opinion, there's only one thing that trumps the mind, and that's the breath. Um, but if I wanted to really help people cultivate this sense of peace and well being within themselves, I had to help them cultivate a relationship to their mind. And for me to do that, I had to cultivate my own relationship to my mind. And when I went into that silent retreat, which is called a Vipassana retreat, I had in yoga what we call asana practice, which is practice of postures. But I had not yet cultivated a daily meditation retreat. So that was my way of throwing myself into deep end. And what it did for me is it cultivated a whole new relationship to my mind. And the first 5 days of that retreat were absolute torture. It was agony. It was hard. All I wanted to do was get up and run. And there was a guide in the retreat, and he said something that brought me to recognize that all the thoughts, all the anxiety, and all the thoughts that were plaguing my mind sounded like this, Ben. My girlfriend was cheating on me. My business was going to go bankrupt. All my friends were having a blast and surfing and partying while I was sitting on a cushion. I even made up a narrative that there was going to be a war that would never allow me to get back home. But these are all the things that happened in my mind. And when something happens in the mind, it becomes a reality if we allow that to fester. And I realized about halfway through that everything that I was allowing to fill my mind was based on fear, a fear of losing something, a fear of missing out. But in every way, fear was dictating my reality. And I knew that I didn't want to live from a place of fear. I wanted to live from a place of love. And once I could acknowledge where all these thoughts and all these feelings and emotions were coming from, I won't tell you they never came back, but I now had a relationship to them. And as long as I had a relationship to them, I can see them, acknowledge them, and then may choose differently. I can choose to live from a place of love, or I can choose not to feed these thoughts. But I think when it comes to things like meditation or what happens on a daily basis, people just try to shut them out. So many times I hear people say, I can't meditate, I can't shut my mind up. Well, why would you want to do that? Your mind is a beautiful thing. You don't want to. I describe your mind as a lifelong eternal partner, like a marriage. You will never come home and tell. I don't know if you're married, Ben, but you will never come home and tell your girlfriend or your wife to shut up. I'm pretty sure that won't go very well. So why would we do that to our mind? So that experience for me opened me up to the real possibility of what it means to have a relationship with your mind, to really understand your mind and how that can change someone's entire reality and experience of life.
Thanks for sharing that, Troy. So it sounds like you got, I guess, all this background experience, and you kind of brought that into what you do now, your yoga practice. Because I've read a lot of literature about your yoga and how you go about it, and you talk about
Yeah,
all this mindfulness, this love within yourself, to find that inner peace, and that will kind of help you on your yoga journey. And
yeah,
I guess one thing that I've done some yoga. I'm not an expert per se, and
yeah.
what I have learned is that your focus is all about spirituality and breath work in your yoga. Compared to some other yoga teachings, and so yeah, maybe you can share a little bit about like why you took that approach and how that benefits people that give it a try.
Oh wow, I hope we have a few more hours. This could go a long time. Feel free to jump in and interrupt me or ask questions, Ben, because you've touched on something for me that at the very core is like that is my passion, and that is it's just everything for me, especially when it comes to the practice of yoga, right? It's that you look at the world of yoga now, and there are many different styles of yoga, and there are many different approaches to you practice of yoga. um, for me, it is a spiritual practice, and it holds the potential. I always say that if I did not believe that the practice of yoga deepens someone's relationship to God and increase their capacity to love, I would walk away from it. I would want nothing to do with it, because not that anything is wrong with a physical practice or physical exercise or Pilates or Zumba or any of that stuff. It's just not for me. That's not what I want to spend my time doing. And I think what really deepened my understanding of yoga and the intimacy of the practice. So just to answer your first question, I teach what would commonly be called vinyasa yoga, but I believe that my the approach I take to it is a little bit differently, and it's not my approach. It's just the approach I share. Right? It's one in which the movement is very slow. There's an intimacy of the practice between how someone moves and their breath, right? And a lot of time in our yoga, in the world of yoga, we talk about how important breath is, and we talk about all this stuff, and we talk about mindfulness, and we talk about grace. But then you look at the asana practice, which is the practice of postures, and you have to ask, well, where is it? Because you look at if you walk into a majority of yoga studios and you look at a asana practice or people doing yoga, it looks very aerobic. It looks a lot like exercise, which it is. But one of the most powerful teachings I was that was ever shared with me was by a local teacher. He's a meditation teacher, and he said, "Move with so much grace that you don't disturb the air around you." So that level of intimacy, right? So when I describe this to someone, it's as if someone were doing this and then someone were doing this, right? So to me, the practice of yoga should look a lot like Tai Chi. It should look a lot like this intimacy between breath and body. Now, the very second of teaching says yoga is the quieting of the fluctuations of the mind. So if we're moving quickly and just waving our body around, there's no concentration. Concentration is one of the eight limbs of yoga. So there must be concentration to synchronize breath and body. And then if you start to extend the breath, one of the great teachers, Krishnamacharya, he used to say that asana practice or hatha yoga is pranayama. And he used to describe pranayama as breath extension. So as we move our body and we connect our breath, there is an extension of the breath that moves the body. And when you start to move like this, the practice becomes very intimate. There's an intimacy of a practice that you begin to feel. You actually learn what it is to be present in every moment. So you might be in one posture, and it's not about moving to the other posture. You're not there yet. It's about what happened to space in between one posture and another posture. So moving in and out of postures become just as important. And when we start practicing yoga like this, we increase our capacity to be present. And when we increase our capacity to be present with one another, we increase our capacity to love one another. Because rather than my mind running off to think about future or past or think about what can Ben do for me now, I actually am so present. This is the idea. I'm not saying I am, it's a continuous work in progress. But when we learn to be present, there's no longer Ben and Troy. Because it's the mind that creates separation between Ben and Troy. The mind has been told that we are separate. But when we learn to live so much in the moment, then we don't see separation. We just see the experience as a whole. And when we see that, we begin to see ourselves in everyone else. We begin to see God in everything and everyone around us. And this realization in itself increases our capacity to love. What I would say, I know this is a lot, but there's one more realization for me that completely changed my yoga practice and brought me to realize that my yoga practice was a form of prayer. And when I began to understand the power of my breath and my breath in my yoga practice was one thing. But then I discovered that the word spirit, as in God or Holy Spirit, actually comes from the Latin word spiritus, meaning to breathe. So all of a sudden, I began to, wow, well, if my breath is an element of God, if my breath is some kind of divine agency, a part of God, whatever you consider God to be, form or formless, name or nameless, then my yoga practice has the capacity to be a prayer because God is moving in and out of me 23,000 times a day. But not only is my yoga practice prayer, but my life is prayer. I just last night I was speaking to a friend about this concept of manifestation that we love to talk about in New Age spirituality, and nothing's wrong with it. Manifestation is beautiful. But the way I see it, manifestation has been around for a very long time. It's actually prayer. What manifestation is prayer. And as long as we are breathing and we are in relationship, this is what I invite people to consider. That if breath is a divine agency, as long as we are breathing, we are living embodiments of prayer. Everything we do, every action, every word, every thought is a prayer. It is a manifestation, if you prefer that word. But what this means, Ben, is that, we love to talk about prayer and manifestation as something we consciously do, which is great. But what about all the things we do unconsciously? Those are still prayers. Those are still manifestation. Whether it be talking about someone badly, or whether it be talking about anything in a negative way, or whether it about projecting on an experience or a world around us. Or maybe I walk down the road and there's a hungry man who wants food, but I don't take the time to feed him. That's a prayer. I may not be conscious of it, but I chose not to help someone in need. So, what am I praying for? What am I manifesting in a world, even when I don't realize that I'm manifesting, that I'm praying? So, what I encourage people to see in a nutshell is that we are living embodiments of prayer. And by bringing more, like in a yoga practice, by cultivating more intimacy and intention on our yoga mat, it helps us cultivate more intimacy and intention in our lives. That's what really matters. And when we cultivate more intimacy and intention, we bring more consciousness, more awareness to what is unconscious. And one of my favorite definitions of yoga, I believe it was Krishnamacharya that said, yoga is the making of the unconscious conscious. So I know that was a lot, but in a nutshell, that to me is the power of not just yoga, but intention and intimacy and realizing that we are living embodiments of prayer and manifestation.
Thanks for sharing that very like a very in-depth response there, and you covered many facets of yoga and our way of being, and just kind of curious, there's a lot of people out there, they want to do more, mindfulness, healthier activities, especially the last couple of years, all these restrictions and everything going on around the world, and trying to find
Yeah.
a healthier lifestyle. So just wondering, with all that in mind, like, what's the best way to approach, getting into yoga? And because you talked about mindfulness, and it's almost like we need to be more present with ourselves. It's a huge focus for what your approach there. Now,
Yeah.
should we be trying to focus on that first before we do yoga, or is there certain yoga that can do both at the same time? Like, what would you suggest to someone new and wanting to get into the whole yoga program?
I look at yoga in a very broad lens because yoga means a lot of things, right? You have many different styles and approaches to yoga. And there is immense power in finding a teacher you connect to, finding a teacher that you resonate with, what they represent, their integrity, um, and what they actually bring to the practice. To find a teacher you trust and you feel safe with, there's nothing that really beats that. But with that said, the reality is not everyone is going to walk into a yoga studio. Not everyone is going to feel comfortable walking into a yoga studio or going to a teacher. So some people want to know, well, what can I do on my own, right? And to me, Ben, it's really simple. It's not easy, but it's simple, and it takes dedication, right? But I like to describe the breath and the mind as the most powerful things. And as I just mentioned, if you relate to breath as an element of God and that feels good to you, then great. There's a teaching in yoga that says mind is king of everything. It's by a teacher called BKS Iyengar. He says mind is king of everything, but breath is king of your mind. So your mind dictates your reality completely, right? If I were to tell you, Ben, that that backdrop behind you was pink or yellow, you might tell me, well, I was crazy or colorblind. But what if I always believed that that color was yellow? The fact is that you can't convince me otherwise unless I choose to believe otherwise. So, in mind, in every way, dictates our reality. And sometimes we create these narratives about people in our lives. If I had created a narrative that Ben was a bad guy and that this podcast was going to be a disaster, chances are it would be a disaster. That's how powerful the mind is, right? Um, but breath is king of the mind. And one thing that trains the mind or gives us the ability to deepen our relationship to our mind is our breath. So, with these two things in mind, what I would recommend to someone is two really simple practices. I would say you find a quiet space every day and you sit for 5 or 10 minutes. Set a timer on your phone. Eventually, you might begin sitting for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. But start with 5 minutes. Doesn't have to be much. Start with 5 minutes. That's a lot for some people, right? And you would just set your timer and you would sit. Now, I'm going to also introduce you to how a breath works in a nutshell. But before I get there, when you sit, the first thing you want to do is make sure to be comfortable. You don't have to look like an old Indian man from a million years ago and wrap your legs in a lotus and sit on the floor. You don't have to. I would invite you to make sure your hips are higher than your knees. Make sure you can sit up straight and be alert. That might mean sitting on a chair or sitting on a couch. It's that simple. But if you're not comfortable, your mind's not going to be able to settle. You won't be breathing properly. So get comfortable, sit up tall, close your eyes, look at your mind. Think of your mind and your breath like eternal lovers. The first thing you want to do to create a relationship of intimacy is listen. You don't start talking to right away. Listen to where your mind is. Listen and feel how your body feels. Listen and look at your breath. Just acknowledge them. And then maybe what you might try to do is in an effort to quiet your mind or still your mind, you'll focus on your breath and you'll start to look at your breath. Maybe extend your breath to 3, 4 seconds. Inhale, pause, 3, 4 seconds, you exhale. And you just sit and look at your breath for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The reality is your mind will run away. Your mind is going to take you to some far off land thinking about work or war or whatever you heard on the news or your to do list or your grocery list. Your mind is going to take you to a million different places. And when the mind does, just come back to your breath. And what I invite people to do is acknowledge if your mind is taking you to the same place repeatedly, to the same thing over and over again. And maybe after your meditation, you write it down and you try to understand, why is my mind taking me there? What am I afraid of? What am I afraid of? Why does my mind keep pulling me there? Am I afraid that I don't get it done? Am I afraid that I miss out on an opportunity? Like, what am I really afraid of? And just acknowledging where our thoughts and where our emotions are coming from creates a relationship with it. So it no longer has power over us. We've now acknowledged it, we've seen it, and we're now in relationship to it. And that alone is huge. And that's a simple practice, just to sit and look at the mind, look at the thoughts, and see, without judgment, without judging any of the thoughts as bad, just looking at them and trying to understand them, trying to see where they come from, right? Now, the other thing I would love to just touch on as well is the breath, because I believe a majority of people look at their entire lives or live their entire lives without actually being aware of one breath, without actually knowing how a breath operates or how a breath works. I learned to breathe at 27 years old, 3 years after I had been teaching yoga. And I just asked someone today. I had a breathwork session with them, And the question I love to ask people is when you breathe, so I'll ask you now, Ben, when you inhale, is that a pull or a push of air?
Inhale, that should be a pull.
Yeah, it should be. That's what I would have said as well. That's what I did say at 27 years old. But that's not actually how we breath works, right? And when I learned this, and I want to be clear that what I'm sharing here, this is not yogic philosophy. This is not yogic teaching. This is the anatomy of breath. This is medicine. But how we breath operates is it's a vacuum. So we don't pull air into our body like that's not how breath works, right? So, and a lot of time you hear people say, breathe into your belly, breathe into your belly, breathe into your belly. Well, I understand what they mean, right? Because the diaphragm descends. We have a diaphragm, which is our main muscle of breathing. And that diaphragm descends into your abdomen, which causes your abdomen to bulge as if it were inflating, as if your belly were expanding. But it's important to note that you cannot breathe into your belly unless someone sticks you with a knife, right? You don't actually breathe into your belly. The reason your abdominal cavity expands is because your diaphragm descends into your abdominal cavity, which causes it to expand. Make sense? Where we actually breathe, and I know for a lot of listeners, they don't have this visual, but we breathe in our thoracic cavity. And that pretty much begins just below your rib cage, right up to your sternum or your chest, right? Right up to your collarbone. Now, a thoracic cavity does not just have one dimension. So it's not just about breathing into your diaphragm and your chest. There are 3 and 4 dimensions to expanding and creating space in the thoracic cavity. So, but before we get there, let me explain how breath actually happens. Why does breath move into you, right? It's physics, it's basic physics. If I have a square and your thoracic cavity, imagine it with a square, right? Your rib cage, your chest, your diaphragm. If I have a square and inside that square is a set air pressure, when I expand the volume of that square, if I were to expand it, the air pressure inside of it decreases. It's a law of physics, right? Volume and air pressure are inversely related. If you increase the volume, the air pressure decreases. If you decrease volume, the air pressure increases. Make sense? Good. So when you think of your thoracic cavity now, let's come back to your body. When your diaphragm descends into your abdomen and your rib cage expands left to right, and your sternum and your chest lifts, and your back body expands, what you're doing is you are increasing the volume of your thoracic cavity. When you do that, the air pressure inside of you decreases, which brings us to the second law of physics I'm going to mention. Gases move from high pressure to low pressure. So when the air pressure inside of you decreases, what that means is the air pressure outside of you is now higher than the air pressure inside of you. So that air moves inside of you to create equilibrium. So it's more a push of air from outside your body that moves the air inside of you. All you do is you create space to receive it. Does that make sense?
That's a different way of looking at it, but yeah, it
Yeah,
does make sense.
yeah. Which is why when you go to higher altitudes, the environmental atmospheric pressure is lower, which means you now have to create more space in your body to receive the same amount of air. So I like to, and this isn't my words. There's a yoga teacher called Leslie Kaminoff, who's an amazing breathwork teacher, And he describes breath as shape change. The more we can change the shape of our thoracic cavity and the more space we can create, is the more breath we can receive. Now, here's the thing, Ben. I mean, we could go on for hours about the anatomy of breath, but here's the thing. If your muscles of your body are tight, if you're living in a state of stress or contraction, then all the connected tissue, muscles of your body are restricting the expansion of your thoracic cavity. So many people, they only breathe in the diaphragm, which is the main muscle of breathing, or they only breathe in their chest. If you're really lucky, you'll find someone that breathes into their diaphragm and into their chest. But what about everything else? What about breath moving into rib cage horizontally? What about breathing into back body, right? Now, my mom loves to ask me, she's like, well, you want me to breathe like this all day, every day? Of course not. Much like we talk about the muscle memory of the body, consider that the breath also has memory. So when we sit with our breath for 5, 10 minutes a day, and we start to create this relationship to breath in this way, then when life gets really stressful and we have all these external stimuluses that are coming down on us, creating all this stress and emotion in our body, then our body knows it can go back to this breath to create this sense of calm, this sense of stillness, this sense of ease, because breath is king of the mind. So rather than mind becoming emotionally reactive, the breath now knows what it can do and where it can do to keep us grounded and keep us from, give us the ability to respond to life rather than reacting to life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, thanks for those deep insights there, Troy. So, I guess one of my biggest takeaways from this is, I mean, if there's one thing that we could do, maybe we can give ourselves excuses. I don't got time to go to yoga, exercise, or anything. If there was one thing we could do for maybe 5 to 10 minutes a day, is just shut off all the noise, turn off all your devices, maybe sit down comfortably, upright in a position,
Yeah,
maybe just breathe and just listen to those thoughts that float in and out of your mind, and just be there and not have any other distractions. Maybe like it's a mini silent retreat, I guess, for 5 to 10
yeah,
minutes, perhaps. Maybe
y-
that's maybe one of the biggest takeaways, I guess, for people.
yeah,
Would you say?
absolutely. It's that simple, Ben. It's just about recognizing that your mind and your breath are this is not even, um, to me at least, not in question. Your mind and your breath are the most powerful things you have access to. But we don't spend time getting to know them. We don't spend time getting to understand how to use them or the impact they have on your body. And it's that simple. Consider they are like an eternal marriage. There's no separation, there's no divorce. You're stuck with your breath and your mind for the rest of your life. So it's probably a good idea to begin to make friends with them and spend some time with them. That's simple.
Sounds good. Yes,
Yeah,
great tips there, Troy.
yeah,
So I wanted to ask you one other yoga-related kind of thing. It's more
yeah,
of a hot take type question, literally. So I'm sure you've heard of there's these different types of yoga out there. There's this hot yoga, and then there's the regular yoga, which is a blend of mindfulness and that sort of stuff. And
yeah,
yeah, just wondering what is your take on this whole hot yoga phenomenon, and mostly a North American thing. I guess from what I understand, yeah, you're in like 40-degree temperatures, and some
yeah,
people, like swear by it. It's just such a great workout. You're sweating a bunch. But then I've heard other things where people pass out, and it's kind of maybe a health hazard. Just wondering, where do you land on this whole, hot yoga phenomenon? Good or bad, or just something
yeah.
different?
It's interesting, Ben, because my very first teacher training was hot yoga. It's a brand of yoga originated in Canada, actually now known as Modo Yoga, Moksha Yoga is what it was previously. Um, and our yoga studio in Trinidad is actually it's heated, but I call it more like warm. Like we don't crank it up to really high temperatures. It's more for consistency. So whether you come into a room at 6 a.m. or you come into a room at 5 p.m., that the consistency of the temperature of the room is steady, as steady as we can get it, right? Um, I also have to confess that my personal yoga studio at home is heated, and I love to practice in a hot room personally, even though I live in the Caribbean, right? I think they're two sides to the coin. I think I think heat has benefits because it allows the body to loosen, to warm up, and it also increases sweat, which also your skin is your largest organ. So when you're sweating and you're breathing, this is important. When you're breathing slow, smooth, long breath in while doing a yoga practice in a warm or hot room, it increases detoxification, in my opinion. So I think there are a lot of benefits. However, I am not a fan of extremely hot, and I am not a fan of super aerobic, quick breathing, fast movements in a heated room. Um, I think the heat works for me and our studio and our style of yoga because it is long, smooth breathing, it is intimate movement, um, so I think it's okay. I would have to say I don't think it's for everyone, and I would encourage anyone to pay attention to how their body feels during and after. And at any point in a hot yoga class, it's important to remember that the practice of yoga is not a competition. And if at any point they feel short of breath or dizzy or they feel like they need to lie down, they need to lie down. That could be a sign that maybe hot yoga isn't for them, you know. Um, for me, the reason I like a warm room or a relatively hot room, I don't like it cranking hot. It doesn't feel good to me. There must be circulation. But the reason I connect to that is because I've lived my whole life in the Caribbean. I am by every means in every way a warm blooded creature, which is why I don't come up north in winter, right? Um, I remember a few years ago, I went to India and I was in Rishikesh and it was relatively cold. And for me to do yoga there, my yoga practice looked completely different. It would take me 90 minutes just to warm my body up to be able to do what I could normally do with my body in a warm environment. So, it really depends on the individual. Yoga is in every way an individual practice, and somebody needs to pay attention to what they feel and what works for them and what doesn't.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks for sharing your
Yeah.
take there, Troy. That was really good. So I want to turn to your latest project. You mentioned that you're working on this book, and yeah, I wonder if we can just dive into a little bit about that. I think I was reading, I was on your website. You were thinking about doing this project for some time. Just wonder if you can share, what kind of prompted you just to get her done, and maybe you can share a few themes about this upcoming book.
Yeah, I would love to. So the book is called Popcorn in My Pocket: Insightful Reflections for a Better You and a Better World. Um, and what's funny, Ben, is like I said, I always knew I would write a book one day. Writing and philosophy, for some reason, has always been really close to my heart. And I came up with the name of this book when I was 20 or 21 years old. Maybe a little after. But in my early 20s. And I remember it clearly. I put my hand in my pocket and I used to go to movies every week with my girlfriend at the time. and I discovered some old popcorn in my pocket. And I remember pulling the old popcorn, probably from a week before, and putting it into my mouth, and I ate it. And I said the words, "Popcorn in my pocket" is going to be the name of my first book. That was 20 years ago. And I had no idea what kind of book is that? What would that mean? I had no clue. And I have, over the last decade or so, I have sat and tried to write many times. And it just wasn't the right time. And funny enough, right before the pandemic started, I think that was 2020. I don't, it's all a blur at this point. Um, but January 2020, I believe it may have been, I sat to write and it just all made sense. I knew what popcorn was, I knew what a pocket was, I knew what this book was going to be about, and I sat down. And luckily for me, we were thrown into lockdown, which meant that I had all this time on my hands now. And one or two of my friends in my life, ex girlfriend at that point, was very encouraging. I was just driven. It just came out. It was something I had to do. I woke up every morning. I wrote for 4 to 5 hours with coffee before I did anything else. Um, and what the book is about, popcorn in my pocket, is an analogy, right? Popcorn is a symbol for all the spiritual reflections and insights that we come to in our lives in the human experience. The pocket is like a spiritual pocket. It's a place of knowing, a place of introspection, a place of digesting all of these teachings, right? But I think the problem in the world is one of the issues in the world today. Well, I won't call it an issue, but with in the whole realm of New Age spirituality and the spiritual path, we have a lot of people repeating ideologies and repeating teachings without really understanding them. So we read something and we say, "Oh, that's cool," or we see a post on social media and we repost it without really understanding what it means or asking question, how does this apply to my life? Because it's very easy to repeat something and even to say it doesn't apply to me, but it all applies. The question is, how does it apply? And I don't believe something really becomes knowledge, and I don't believe we really understand the teaching unless we can discover how it applies to our lives and we can actually embody it. So, popcorn in my pocket is reflections and insights that I have learned and embodied and or try to embody. It's an ongoing process in my life, and I share stories from my life that help me do that. And I offer the reader some reflections and insights and maybe hope to inspire their own introspection to discover how these teachings and reflections apply to their own life so they can discover the popcorn in their own pocket. I don't want them to take my popcorn and make it theirs. I invite them to take my popcorn as an inspiration for them to discover their own popcorn, if that makes any sense at all.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Troy. So when I was yeah just looking at, I think it was on your website as well. Like you said for in regards to writing, that you don't want to write for entertainment. You want to write. It's like your duty. So I wonder if you can just
Yeah.
touch a little bit about that. Is it your duty to share some different inspirations to spur people on to bigger and better things, perhaps?
I've never considered myself an artist, Ben. I'm not very good at painting or drawing, or even though my family is musicians, I'm not a musician. Um, a lot of people refer to me as maybe being an artist. Like when I step in, the way I shape a yoga room, they call art, or the way you live your life is art. And writing, by every means, is an art form. And it's one that I'm slowly developing and learning. But I don't know. It feels strange to me because if if I did not think anyone would read my book, I wouldn't write. Like I'm not, I'm, maybe I will, I don't know, but I don't write for me. It's not just for me to express myself in my writing. Writing in itself alone does not bring me a joy and fulfillment that lights my heart up. Maybe it will over time. I love writing, but I love writing because I know I get to share ideas that are going to influence and impact readers. And that's why I love writing. Because for me, it's like, how do I say this? With regards to human experience, we're all going to leave our bodies. That's the one thing for sure. That's the one surety in life is that we're all going to leave our bodies. Here's another certainty in life. At some point after we leave our bodies, be it in 10, 20, 100, 200, 300, 400 years, a century, our names will be forgotten. No one will remember who we are. No one will remember our names. No one will remember what we did. But the vibration and the energy and the resonance with which we live our lives and how we make people feel will impact how they live their lives. And this is, again, this conversation could take another 3 hours, but science says that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, it merely changes state. We are energy, we are living energy, we are living resonance. And our actions, our words, and our thoughts are also living energy and resonance. So for me, it only makes sense that I have or I seek to make my life be something bigger than myself. That the resonance and vibration with which I live my life or inspire others to live their life and create their own positive resonance and vibration, to me, that's one of the things that human experience is about. That is what is important. Because if I live my life to serve my own desires and my wants and needs and my pleasures, all of that is beautiful and all of that is important. But for me, it doesn't feel right to make that my priority. I feel that in some way I need to serve something greater. And that's what gives me a sense of purpose, to at least know that I'm trying to do that. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great, Troy. Yeah, those are some really powerful statements there. And
Yeah,
on that note, on writing and powerful statements, I think this was on your Instagram page. Perhaps you tend to put out some interesting quotes here and there. And I wanted to read one out to you and just
sure.
unpack this one for you. I just found it kind of interesting. So,
Oh, this is fun, Ben. I like this.
yeah. So here it goes. According to Troy, our conversations have the power to dissolve the illusion of our differences. I really like this one because I think it applies to everybody. And, if maybe our leaders in the world listen to this more, maybe there'll be less conflict, less intensity of a conflict, and just to, find, engage in more conversations, regardless of your background, your history, or whatever happened. That'll lead to, more collaboration and, probably better solutions and a better world. Is that kind of where you were at with that statement? I wonder if you can share a little bit about your thought process on that one.
Yeah, yeah, of course. That's actually from my book. That quote's from my book. Um, and it's from a chapter called Transformational Conversation and what that actually means. Now, you see, Ben, we've all been conditioned in certain ways. And we all have a sense of identity. And our sense of identity has, as we live our lives, it extends to our opinions and our ideologies. We even our emotions, we get so attached to our opinions that somebody might say something like, I am democratic. I am Republican, I am anti vax, I am pro vax, whatever, right? Our identity, our sense of being, we attach to our opinions and our perspectives of the world. Now, there's a problem with that in itself. So I'll just mention it first. But if I say that I am a Democrat, then that means I can never be a Republican. So I've just locked myself in a box and I've stunted my own growth because I can no longer expand my perspective to consider something different. Same thing, not to speak of a charged topic, but if I were to say I am anti-vax, then that means I can never change my mind, right? And that goes for anything, vegan, meat eater, whatever you want to call it. We define ourselves by our opinions, our perspectives, and our ideologies. What this means is that very often, when someone holds a different opinion or a different perspective, it's almost like unconsciously we feel that we are being attacked personally, when that's not the case. It's not a personal attack. Someone just holds a different opinion or perspective. And that opinion and perspective comes from different experiences and different conditioning, right? Me and you, Ben, I'm pretty sure we have different opinions and ideologies on a lot of things. You grew up in Vancouver, I grew up in Trinidad. That alone is different. And when we come into conversation with people, it's almost like we're coming into war because we're taking it so personally. Whereas, get this, you may hold an opinion or a perspective that I don't agree with, right? Let me use an example here, right? And I'm not putting this on you. But if someone was an atheist and said they do not believe in God, I understand. I can understand, even though I believe in spirit and God in every cell of my body, I understand why someone will not want to. I understand why someone might not. And that is the basis for a conversation to happen. Is that when we seek to understand where someone is coming from, why they feel a certain way, what conditioning has caused them to adopt certain beliefs and perspectives of the world, and more so to understand what are they afraid of, what is driving them. Because if we really start to have a conversation, like a heart to heart conversation, and we have different perspectives and beliefs, we might come to realize that our intentions are the same. We have the same intentions. Even that we have the same outcome. We want the same outcome, but our approach might be different. So the first common ground to any transformational conversation is understanding one another and starting to dissolve the narratives that we carry about people. One of my teachers, Sean Corn, she talks about this. I have it tattooed on my arm. Ignore the story, see the soul. And we have these stories about everyone in our society. And if we can move beyond the story and dissolve that story, we can actually see the soul that lives beneath. And when we see that, we can begin to understand people and realize that we're actually not as different as we thought we were. Everyone wants to feel safe. Everyone wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants to be loved. And I think that begins with real heart to heart conversation. And I honestly believe that vulnerable heart to heart conversation, vulnerable is key. Putting everything on the table can dissolve all of our differences, all of them. And even if we leave that conversation still with different opinions, we can at least understand each other a lot better so that we're not at war. We're not at war. We might even soften our own beliefs or realize that maybe there's something we may have been missing, right? And so I do think vulnerable, authentic, heartfelt conversation in which we listen, not listen to project, but listen to understand one another, is has the power to dissolve any difference there is on the planet.
Yeah, those are some great thoughts there, Troy. And yeah, it's funny you mentioned these things. I had a thought in my head because your belief system, how that evolved. I mean, very similar to kind of how I kind of approach things over time. I kind of got here, and I was thinking when I was younger, I was so rigid in my views. I had to be on, one side or the other, whatever the issue may be, and
Yeah,
just thinking when I'm if I'm talking passionately about something, maybe I don't think my breath, is very open, and so it's almost like when you become more open minded, you're open up and everything all kind of connects. So I'm trying to connect with you were talking about breath work, spirituality, and
yeah,
it's all connected, isn't it? It's
yeah,
opens your mind, opens your body, opens your soul to new ideas and everything, right? And new possibilities.
yeah, absolutely. Now, there are times, Ben, like, especially recently I had an experience where I was talking to someone about something, um, and I got really worked up and really passionate about it. But in my getting worked up, I almost got fired up because I got so passionate that it almost gave the impression that I was angry. But it wasn't that I was angry. It was that I wanted them to get something I know to be true. Science knows to be true. And I felt that they were just missing a point. Now, eventually, I think I did get through that point somewhat. However, here's the reality. If I had kept my cool more, if I'd kept my tone down more, maybe I may have been able to communicate my message a lot more efficiently. So, what I did that night is I went home and I looked up every TED talk and every article I could find on the topic. So now I have more means in which I can communicate that, right? Um, and we all get passionate. We all get worked up. One of my close friends, he's a yoga teacher in Vancouver, actually. His name is Troy Turi. He has a great name. He says he points out that passion comes from suffering. Suffering is actually the root of the word passion. Sometimes when we get overly passionate and worked up about something, it actually causes us suffering. Yeah, interesting perspective.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that perspective, Troy.
Yeah,
So as we're winding down this podcast, I like to ask my guests, a two-part question, and so it goes like this:
yeah.
What are you most grateful for, and what are you most looking forward to in the future?
Wow. All right. What am I most grateful for? I am grateful for knowing love, Ben, because when we talk about privilege, we talk about a lot of things. We talk about race, we talk about wealth, we talk about opportunity, talk about gender, we talk about heterosexual, homosexual, um, but we don't often talk about love. And I think love is the greatest privilege of all. My whole life, from my family to my friends, I have repeatedly been shown love. And so I know what it is to be loved and supported and cared for. And to be surrounded by people that continuously show me what love is and remind me of what it means to love from a very young age has given me the ability to do my very best to love others and to remind others what love actually is. So I think right now, if I had to answer this question, who knows? My answer might change day to day, moment to moment. But right now, my answer is I am grateful for knowing what it means to be loved.
Excellent. And
Yeah.
what are you most looking forward to in the future?
I am looking forward to the, not to use this as a plug somewhat, but to the release of my book because I've poured my entire heart and soul into it for the last 3.5 years. And it has all of me in it. And it's funny. I've wanted a traditional publishing deal, and I've been going out to literary agents, and publishers, and I've been getting the most encouraging rejections. They love the book, they love the content, it's amazing, but everyone gets stuck on social media following. Like you only have 7,000 followers. Like how are we gonna sell that book, right? They want 50, 100,000 followers. So right now I am just torn on, do I self-publish? Do I wait it out and get a traditional publisher? And it's a big decision for me because I believe this book has the power to move and inspire and change people's lives. And I'm just really looking forward to finding a way through making a decision and to having for this book getting out there into the world so that I can continue on to book two and start reaching people and making more of an impact.
Excellent. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing, Troy. So, if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
TroyHaddy.com is my website. They can find me on Instagram. I would recommend that people follow me on Instagram and go to my website, sign up for my newsletter, stay posted. I may be giving some little updates and releasing little snippets of the book. And they also, if they want to practice yoga with me or even do privates or anything, they can find me. We have our own online platform called beyondyogatv.com. So those are three main avenues that I would love people to reach out and follow and join. And if they have any questions at all, please feel free to ask. And I do believe if they sign up for my newsletter, they'll get a few free online videos and classes and stuff as well.
Thanks for sharing, Troy. We'll be sure to add those to our show notes. So that's a wrap for episode 6. Thanks for joining us, and namaste, everyone.